He was tricked into a blind date with a woman in a wheelchair. What she told him. It didn't just shock the city's most feared mafia boss, it broke him completely. The moment Ben Wade walked into Il Posto and saw Tina Morales sitting at that corner table, everything he thought he knew shattered. She had agreed to this blind date. One meeting. Nothing more. But the way she looked at him, steady, unafraid, almost pitying, made it clear that nothing about that moment was what he expected. And what she told him before the night was over. No one, not even Ben himself, was ready for it. Before continuing the story, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories to you. Everyone in the city knew that Ben Wade did not negotiate. He did not compromise. He eliminated problems. People disappeared when he gave the word. That was why the entire restaurant seemed to shift when the hostess pointed him toward the back corner, and his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, expensive Italian leather on marble, echoed through the room. "Mr. Wade, she's waiting for you." Ben Wade stopped mid-stride, his jaw tightening beneath his perfectly trimmed beard. His tailored black suit fit like armor. His presence commanded silence. His reputation cleared rooms. He had been running the South Side for 8 years, and before that, he had been the enforcer everyone whispered about. No one tricked Ben Wade. No one set him up. But his sister had. He took a breath, sharp, controlled, and his eyes scanned the dimly lit restaurant until they landed on her. The woman at table 9. The one his meddling sister, Lucia, had insisted he meet. "Just one dinner, Ben. For me. Please." She sat with her back to the wall, blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, wearing a fitted pink dress that would have turned heads anywhere. Her posture was elegant. Her hands were folded neatly on the table. Her expression was calm, and she was in a wheelchair. Ben's first instinct was to turn around and leave. His second was to call Lucia and make her regret this stunt. But then the woman's eyes lifted, green, sharp, unflinching, and locked onto his. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply said his name. Ben Wade. Not Mr. Wade. Not the polite, nervous greeting of someone trying to impress him. Just his name. Like she knew him. Like she had been waiting for this moment for years. He felt his blood go cold. People rarely looked at Ben twice without fear in their eyes, but she was looking now. And the way she was looking at him, like she could see straight through the tailored suit, the power, the reputation, down to something he had buried a long time ago, made him stop completely. He walked forward slowly, every instinct screaming at him to leave, to end this, to regain control. But something in her gaze held him. Something familiar. Something that terrified him more than any bullet ever had. He reached the table, towering over her, his shadow falling across the white tablecloth. His voice came out low, controlled, edged with warning. "You know who I am." It wasn't a question. Tina Morales leaned back slightly in her wheelchair, tilting her head as if considering him, measuring him, weighing him, judging him. Her lips curved into the faintest, saddest smile. "I know exactly who you are, Ben," she said quietly. "The question is, do you remember me?" And in that moment, the most feared man in the city felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. He felt afraid. Ben Wade had killed men for less than this. The text from Lucia still burned in his pocket like a lit fuse. Table 9. Il Posto. 8 p.m. "Don't you dare embarrass me." His sister had a gift for manipulation, wrapping demands in guilt, coding threats in sisterly affection. She was the only person alive who could still make him feel like the scared kid from the South Side tenements, back when their biggest concern was whether Mama could stretch the rice and beans for one more meal. That didn't mean he had to like it. Ben's Mercedes pulled up to the valet stand with the quiet purr of German engineering and old money. The kid in the red vest practically tripped over himself opening the door, eyes wide with recognition. Everyone knew the car. Everyone knew the man who drove it. Ben stepped out, straightening his cuffs with practiced precision, and the cold October air bit at his face like a warning. Il Posto was the kind of restaurant where senators ate next to surgeons, where deals worth millions happened over wine that cost more per bottle than most people made in a month. Soft piano music drifted through the entrance. Candlelight flickered in the windows. It was elegant, refined, completely wasted on whatever social climbing opportunist Lucia had decided he needed to meet. Mr. Wade. The hostess appeared instantly, a slim woman in black with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Fear and professionalism fought for dominance in her expression. Professionalism won, barely. Your party is already seated. Right this way. Of course she is, Ben muttered, following her through the maze of white tablecloths and hushed conversations. Heads turned as he passed. A city councilman he'd bought last year nodded nervously. A defense attorney who owed him 3 favors suddenly found her wine glass fascinating. The restaurant didn't go silent. Il Posto was too sophisticated for that, but the quality of the silence changed. Sharpened. Ben Wade was in the room, and everyone knew it. His mind was already composing the text he'd send Lucia. Something cutting. Something that would make her regret this amateur hour setup. He'd stay for exactly 1 drink, make his excuses with whatever desperate socialite was waiting, and she's waiting for you. The hostess gestured to table 9, tucked into the back corner where the lighting was softer, more intimate. Where privacy was guaranteed and exits were limited. Ben's eyes tracked to the table automatically, already preparing the cold assessment he'd perfected over years of reading threats and weaknesses. Then he saw her, and every thought in his head went silent. She was beautiful. That registered first, before his brain could catch up with the rest. Blonde hair that caught the candlelight like spun gold, falling in waves over bare shoulders. A pink dress that was tasteful but striking, the kind that suggested confidence rather than desperation. Her face was turned slightly away, profile sharp and elegant against the dark wood paneling. She looked like she belonged in this restaurant. Like she'd been carved from the same expensive marble as the floors. Then his gaze dropped, following the line of the table, and he saw the wheelchair. Chrome and sleek, positioned carefully against the booth. Her hands rested on the armrests with the kind of casual familiarity that came from years, not months. This wasn't temporary. This was permanent. Ben felt something twist in his chest, not pity. He'd learned long ago that pity was a luxury he couldn't afford, but something else. Something like recognition, though he couldn't place why. He should leave. Every instinct honed by years of survival screamed at him to turn around, to text Lucia that she'd crossed a line, to get back in his car and pretend this never happened. He didn't do charity cases. He didn't do pity dates. She turned her head, and their eyes met. Green. Her eyes were green, the color of sea glass, of old bottles pulled from the harbor, of things that survived when they shouldn't. And the way she looked at him, steady, unflinching, with something that looked almost like sadness, froze him in place more effectively than any weapon ever had. She knew him. Not just his reputation, not just his name, but him. He could see it in the way her gaze moved across his face, cataloging, remembering, comparing the man standing before her to some memory he couldn't access. Ben's hand flexed at his side, a tell he'd trained himself out of years ago. He forced his feet to move, carrying him toward the table with the same controlled confidence he brought to every negotiation, every confrontation, every moment when showing weakness meant death. He stopped at the table's edge, looming over her without meaning to, his shadow falling across the white linen like a stain. His voice came out harder than he intended, sharp with the anger he'd been nursing since Lucia's text. I don't know what my sister told you, but this was a mistake. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a scientist might study a specimen under glass. Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch at his tone, didn't shrink from his presence, didn't do any of the things people usually did when Ben Wade turned his full attention on them. Instead, she smiled. It was the saddest smile he'd ever seen. Sit down, Ben, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something he couldn't name. We have a lot to talk about. And despite every rule he'd ever made for himself, despite every instinct screaming danger, despite the fact that he could walk away right now and never look back, Ben Wade pulled out the chair and sat down. Ben didn't remove his jacket. That was the first signal. He sat with his back straight, one hand resting on the table, the other hidden in his lap where his phone waited. Every line of his body language screamed temporary. He was a man built for exits, and he was already planning his. "I'll make this simple," he said, his voice carrying the flat efficiency of a business transaction. No warmth. No curiosity. Just the cold arithmetic of a man who'd learned to calculate the cost of everything, including his time. "My sister means well, but she doesn't understand boundaries. Whatever she promised you, whatever story she sold, she didn't promise me anything," Tina interrupted, her fingers tracing the stem of her untouched water glass. "I'm the one who agreed to this. Not her." That made him pause. Ben's eyes narrowed, reassessing. Women didn't usually volunteer for his company, not anymore. Not since his reputation had calcified into something that preceded him into every room like a toxic cloud. The ones who sought him out wanted something: protection, money, status, revenge. The currency varied, but the transaction was always the same. "Then you know who I am," he said. Not a question. A statement. "Everyone knows who you are, Ben Wade." She said his full name like she was testing the weight of it, feeling how it sat in her mouth. "The question is whether you know who I am." He didn't. He'd scanned her face the moment he sat down, running it through the mental database of every associate, every enemy, every person who'd ever crossed his path in 8 years of running the South Side. Nothing. She was beautiful enough to remember, distinctive enough to place, and yet nothing. "Should I?" he asked, an edge creeping into his voice. "Not yet." She leaned back in her wheelchair, and something about the movement, the casual grace of it, the lack of self-consciousness, suggested this wasn't a woman who spent time apologizing for taking up space. "But you will." Ben's jaw tightened. He didn't like puzzles unless he was the one setting them. He didn't like losing control of conversations, and this woman, whoever she was, had taken control the moment their eyes met. That was unacceptable. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the leather checkbook he kept for situations exactly like this, and set it on the table with the deliberate care of a man playing his trump card. The pen followed, expensive and heavy. Montblanc. The kind that signed contracts worth millions. "Here's what's going to happen," Ben said, his voice dropping into the register he used for negotiations that weren't really negotiations at all. "I'm going to write you a check. You're going to take it, thank my sister for her concern, and we're both going to forget this ever happened. How much do you need?" He flipped open the checkbook, pen poised, waiting for her to name her price. They always did, eventually. Everyone had a number. Everyone had a breaking point where dignity became negotiable and pride became a luxury they couldn't afford. Tina looked at the checkbook, then at the pen, then at Ben, and then she laughed. It wasn't the nervous titter of someone intimidated or the calculated giggle of someone playing coy. It was genuine, full-throated laughter that turned heads at nearby tables and made Ben's hand freeze over the empty check. The sound of it was bright and sharp, like glass breaking, like something shattering that couldn't be put back together. "You think," she had to stop, pressing her fingers to her lips, eyes bright with something between amusement and fury. "You actually think I'm here for your money?" "Everyone's here for something," Ben said coldly, fighting the heat rising in his chest. Embarrassment. Anger. Something else he couldn't name. "Name your price so we can both get on with our lives." She reached across the table fast, before he could react, and plucked the checkbook from under his hand. For a moment he thought she was going to write the number herself, claim whatever amount her pride would allow her to justify. Instead, she tore the blank check from the book with one clean motion. Then she ripped it in half. The sound was soft, but definitive in the quiet restaurant. She tore it again. And again. Precise, deliberate tears that reduced his offer to confetti. The pieces fluttered to the table between them like snow, like ash, like the remnants of something burned beyond recognition. "Your money," Tina said quietly, her voice now stripped of all amusement, "is as worthless as your reputation, Mr. Wade." The words hit him like a physical blow. Ben Wade had been threatened by men holding guns to his head and felt less rattled than he did in this moment, watching this woman in pink demolish his attempt at control with nothing but paper and truth. "You don't know anything about my reputation," he said, but even he could hear how hollow it sounded. "I know exactly what your reputation is worth." She gathered the torn pieces of check in her palm, then let them fall like rain back onto the table. I know what it cost to build it. I know who paid the price for it. And I know," her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to reveal the anger beneath the composure. "I know that you sitting here, trying to buy your way out of this conversation, proves everything people say about you is true." Ben's hand curled into a fist on the table. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Tina leaned forward, and the candlelight caught the tears she refused to let fall. "Tell me, Ben, when's the last time someone told you no? When's the last time your money couldn't fix something? When's the last time you had to actually face what you've done?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm, like a grave, like all the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become. Ben Wade had no answer. The waiter appeared like a ghost materializing from the shadows, reading the tension at the table with the practiced eye of someone paid to be invisible. He started to speak, registered the torn paper scattered across the white linen, saw Ben's expression, and retreated without a word. Even the staff at Il Posto knew when to leave Ben Wade alone. But Tina wasn't finished. "October 15th, she said softly, her fingers now folded in her lap, her gaze distant. 10 years ago. Does that date mean anything to you?" Ben's mind recoiled instinctively. October 15th. A decade ago, he would have been what? 26. Still working under Marcus Morales, still learning the business, still young enough to believe he could navigate this world without losing himself completely. That was before he'd taken over the South Side. Before his reputation had been built on fear instead of respect. "Should it?" he asked, but his voice had lost its edge. Something in her tone had shifted the ground beneath him. "It was raining," Tina continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "The kind of rain that turns the streets into rivers, that makes the whole city smell like rust and regret. You remember how the South Side floods when it rains like that? How the drainage system hasn't been updated since the 60s, how the water pools in the intersections like it's trying to reclaim the neighborhood." She was painting a picture, and against his will, Ben could see it. Could feel the memory trying to surface through 10 years of deliberately forgotten details. "The warehouse district," she said. "Pier 17. There was supposed to be a meeting that night, wasn't there? You and Marcus." Her voice caught on the name, and Ben felt his blood go cold. "You and my father. Marcus Morales." The name hit him like a freight train, and suddenly Ben was 26 again, standing in the rain outside a warehouse that didn't exist anymore, waiting for the man who'd taught him everything about this life. The man who'd pulled him off the streets when he was 19 and angry and stupid. The man who'd shown him that power didn't have to come from a gun, that respect could be earned instead of taken. The man who died in an explosion that was meant for someone else. Ben's hand went still on the table. He stared at Tina, really looked at her now and saw it. The shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the way she held herself with dignity even when the world had tried to take everything from her. Marcus had shown him pictures once, years ago, of his daughter, a college student studying architecture, bright and ambitious and completely separate from the life her father lived. "Tina," Ben breathed, and the name tasted like ash in his mouth. "Tina Morales." "There he is," she said quietly. "I was wondering when you'd remember." The restaurant seemed to tilt around him. Ben had spent a decade building walls between himself and that night, fortifying his memories with silence and violence and the kind of willful forgetting that required constant maintenance. He'd told himself Marcus's family had been taken care of. That money had been sent. That arrangements had been made. He'd never asked if those arrangements had been enough. He'd never asked what happened to the daughter. "You were at NYU," he said, the details coming back in fragments. "Studying architecture." Marcus was so proud. "He showed me your sketches once, said you were going to design buildings that would outlast all of us." "I was," Tina agreed. "Until that rainy night on the South Side when my father asked me to drive him to Pier 17 because his usual driver was sick." Her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Funny how one decision can rewrite your entire future, isn't it?" Ben felt the walls he'd built start to crack. "You weren't supposed to be there." "No," she said. "I wasn't. I was supposed to be at a gallery opening in Manhattan. I was supposed to be drinking cheap wine and pretending to understand abstract expressionism. I was supposed to be 22 and stupid and completely untouched by my father's world." She leaned forward, and the candlelight made shadows dance across her face. But he called, and I answered, because that's what you do when your father needs you. You show up. Even when showing up costs you everything. The explosion. Ben remembered the heat of it, the way the night had turned orange and red and white all at once. He remembered the ringing in his ears, the taste of copper in his mouth, the feeling of the ground dropping out from under him. He'd woken up 3 blocks away, pulled from the wreckage by someone he never saw, someone who'd disappeared before the police arrived. The warehouse, he said slowly. The bomb. You were in the car, Tina finished. Parked 50 feet away, waiting for my father to finish his meeting so I could drive him home. Close enough to see everything. Close enough to feel the shockwave. Close enough that when the second explosion happened, the one in the support column that brought half the building down, a piece of rebar went through the driver's side door like it was made of paper. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was describing the weather, but Ben could see the tremor in her hands. Could see the cost of maintaining that composure. Tina, he started, but she held up a hand. I've spent 10 years wondering if you even remembered that night, she said. If you ever thought about the people who paid for your survival. Ben Wade, the man who never apologized, who never showed weakness, felt something inside him begin to break. What would you do if you discovered the truth about your past changed everything about your future? Drop your thoughts below, I need to know what you think happens next. Ben's throat had gone dry. He reached for his water glass, when had the waiter filled it, and took a drink that did nothing to wash away the taste of memory flooding back. The warehouse. The rain. Marcus Morales checking his watch one last time before heading inside, telling Ben to wait, that this meeting was delicate and required a lighter touch than Ben's presence would allow. I should have gone in with him, Ben said, the words rough. He told me to wait by the south entrance, said the fewer people in the room, the better. If you'd be dead too, Tina cut him off. Her voice was steady, but her fingers had gone white where they gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. The bomb was rigged to the conference room door. Motion activated. The second my father walked in, she stopped, swallowed hard. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for everything to end. Ben remembered the sound. He'd heard explosions before, in movies, in controlled demolitions, even once in a car 2 blocks from his apartment when he was 15. But nothing prepared you for the real thing, for the way it didn't just reach your ears, but invaded your entire body, shaking your bones, stopping your heart for one impossible moment. I was checking my phone, Tina continued, her gaze fixed on something Ben couldn't see, some private screening of a horror film she'd watched 1,000 times. Some stupid text from a friend about the gallery opening I was missing. And then the world turned white. She paused, and in that silence, Ben could hear it again, the concussive blast, the shriek of metal, the rain hissing against superheated debris. The car alarm went off, she said. Isn't that stupid? In the middle of everything, the fire, the screaming, the building starting to collapse, all I could think was that I needed to turn off the car alarm. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear anything else, but I knew it was going off. I could feel it vibrating through the steering wheel. Ben's hands had curled into fists on the table. He wanted to stop her, to tell her she didn't have to relive this, but he also knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from years of guilt, that he needed to hear it. That he deserved to hear it. I got the door open, Tina said. I don't remember how. Adrenaline, maybe. Shock. My legs were working then, and I remember thinking I needed to get to my father, I needed to find him, her voice cracked, and she took a breath that shook her entire frame. And then I saw you. Ben went very still. You were on the ground near the south entrance, half buried in debris. There was so much blood, Ben. I thought you were dead. I was sure of it. But then you moved, and I realized you were trying to crawl away from the building. She looked at him now, really looked at him, and her eyes were filled with something that looked like accusation and grief in equal measure. The second explosion happened 30 seconds later. The support columns. Someone had rigged them to blow on a delay, to make sure no one got out. The memory was coming back now in sharp, painful focus. Ben remembered the ground beneath him, slick with rain and his own blood. Remembered the ringing in his ears, the way his vision had tunneled down to a pinpoint of light. Remembered hands, small hands, strong hands, grabbing his jacket and pulling. You, he whispered. It was you. I dragged you 20 feet, Tina said, and there was no pride in her voice, only flat recitation of facts. You're what, 6'2"? 200 pounds? I weighed 120 soaking wet, and I dragged you 20 feet across broken concrete and glass because I couldn't reach my father, and you were right there, and you were still breathing. Ben felt something lodge in his chest, sharp and unforgiving. Tina, the second explosion happened when I was going back, she continued, speaking over him, speaking through him. I'd gotten you far enough away that I thought maybe I could still reach the entrance. Maybe my father had made it out. Maybe. She stopped, closed her eyes. The rebar came through the driver's side of the car like a missile. I was standing right next to it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the quiet murmur of the restaurant seemed to have fallen away, leaving just the two of them suspended in this moment of terrible truth. It went through my spine at L1, Tina said, her voice clinical now, detached. Incomplete spinal cord injury. The doctors said I was lucky that it didn't sever completely. Lucky that I had some sensation left. Lucky to be alive. She opened her eyes, and they were dry, burning with something fiercer than tears. I spent 6 months in the hospital. 18 months in physical therapy. I learned to use a wheelchair. I learned to live with chronic pain. I learned that the future I'd planned, the buildings I was going to design, the life I was going to live, was gone. I didn't know, Ben said, and the words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. I swear to God, Tina, I didn't know it was you. I woke up in a safe house 3 days later. My people told me someone had pulled me out, but they never found out who. I assumed it was one of Marcus's crew, someone who what? Tina asked quietly. Someone who disappeared? Someone you didn't bother to find? Someone whose life you didn't think was worth investigating? She was right. He'd been so focused on recovering, on finding out who'd set the bomb, on consolidating power in the vacuum Marcus's death had created, that he'd never asked the right questions. Never followed up. Never wondered about the cost of his survival. I saved your life, Ben, Tina said, and her voice finally broke. And you never even knew my name. Ben couldn't speak. The words that normally came so easily, the threats, the negotiations, the cold dismissals, were ash in his throat. He sat across from Tina Morales, the woman who had saved his life at the cost of her own future, and felt the full weight of a debt he could never repay pressing down on him like a physical thing. Why now? He finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. 10 years, Tina. Why are you here now? She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her composure waver for the first time since he'd sat down. Her hand moved to the small purse hanging from her wheelchair, fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a letter, something official, he could tell from the weight of it, the way it had been creased and refolded so many times the paper had gone soft. She placed it on the table between them, right on top of the scattered pieces of his torn check. Read it, she said. Ben unfolded the paper, his hands steadier than they had any right to be. It was a notice from Mount Sinai Hospital. Medical jargon filled most of the page, but certain phrases jumped out at him like they were highlighted in neon. Syringomyelia, progressive neurological deterioration, surgical intervention required, estimated cost of treatment. The number at the bottom had so many zeros it took him a moment to process it. The rebar didn't just damage my spine, Tina said quietly. It created scar tissue. For 10 years, that scar tissue has been stable. Manageable. I've lived with the wheelchair, the pain, the limitations. I made peace with it. Her laugh was bitter. Or I thought I had. But 6 months ago, the scar tissue started to shift. It's creating a cyst that's growing along my spinal cord. The doctors call it a syrinx. Ben's medical knowledge was limited to the practical, where to shoot someone to incapacitate versus kill, how to recognize internal bleeding, basic field medicine that had saved his life more than once. But he understood enough to know that anything growing along the spinal cord was a death sentence waiting to happen. They can operate, Tina continued. There's a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins who specializes in this kind of thing. The success rate is good, 70% chance of stopping the progression, maybe even restoring some function. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was hollow. But the surgery costs $400,000. My insurance covers about a third of that. And she checked her phone, a gesture so casual it made the words that followed even more devastating. I have 8 weeks to raise the rest before the syrinx reaches C4. After that, the surgery becomes too risky. After that, I start losing function in my arms, my lungs, everything. Ben felt the words hit him like bullets. 8 weeks. 2 months. 60 days between this woman and complete paralysis, between mobility and a ventilator, between a life with limitations and no life at all. That's not all, Tina said, and somehow her voice got even quieter. I'm being evicted. She pulled out another piece of paper, and Ben didn't need to read this one to know what it said. He'd seen enough eviction notices in his life, had been on both sides of them. His mother had received 3 before she died. He delivered dozens as Marcus's enforcer, back when collecting rent from delinquent tenants was considered good training. The building where my father's apartment it's being sold, Tina explained. Luxury condos. They're offering buyouts to the rent-controlled tenants, but I don't own the lease. My father did. When he died, I should have transferred it legally, but I was in the hospital, and then rehab, and by the time I thought about it, she shrugged, a gesture of exhausted defeat. It doesn't matter. They want me out in 30 days. Everything I have left of my father, 10 years of adapting that space to my needs, gone. Ben's mind was already calculating. $400,000 for the surgery. First and last month's rent on an accessible apartment in the city, maybe another $10,000. Medical equipment, ongoing care, physical therapy. The numbers kept climbing, but numbers were something he understood. Numbers he could fix. I can write you a check right now, he said, reaching for the checkbook before remembering she'd torn up his last offer. Whatever you need, I don't want your money, Ben. Tina's voice cut through his offer like a blade. Did you hear nothing I just said? I didn't come here for a handout. Then why are you here? The question came out sharper than he intended, edged with frustration and confusion, and the guilt that was threatening to drown him. If you don't want money, if you don't want help, why track me down? Why agree to this date? Why tell me any of this? Tina met his eyes, and in the candlelight, he saw tears she refused to let fall. Because I'm dying, Ben, she said simply. And before I do, before I lose the ability to speak, to move, to exist as anything more than a body in a bed, I needed you to know what your life cost. I needed you to look at me and understand that you're only sitting here because I chose to save you instead of my father. I chose you, and it destroyed me. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I needed you to live with that. The way I've had to live with it every single day for 10 years. If saving someone's life cost you everything, would you still make the same choice? Subscribe to find out if Ben can save the woman who saved him. The movement came from Ben's peripheral vision, 2 figures approaching from the bar, cutting through the elegant crowd with the kind of purposeful stride that announced exactly what they were. His security. Victor and Dimitri, the men who shadowed him everywhere, who'd been waiting outside in the black SUV until their instincts or their watches told them this meeting had gone on too long. Victor reached the table first, his hand already moving to Ben's shoulder in a gesture that looked casual, but was anything but. Boss, we should leave. Ben's voice was steel-wrapped in ice, the tone he used when he needed obedience without question. He didn't look up from Tina's face, didn't break eye contact. Now. Sir, it's been 40 minutes, Dimitri said, his accent thick with concern and protocol. You said 30 maximum for I said leave. This time Ben did look up, and whatever Victor and Dimitri saw in his expression made them both take a step back. Go back to the car. Don't come back unless the building is on fire. Are we clear? The 2 men exchanged glances, a silent conversation happening in the language of soldiers and bodyguards who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words. Ben knew what they were thinking. He'd never dismissed them before, never sent them away from a meeting, never prioritized a conversation over his own security. Boss, Victor tried one more time, his voice low. We don't know who I know exactly who she is, Ben said, and the words came out raw, stripped of all the authority he usually wielded like a weapon. And you're going to walk away right now, or you're going to find new employment tomorrow morning. Choose. Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, sir. He gestured to Dmitri, and the two of them retreated through the restaurant, though Ben could feel their reluctance in every step. The other diners who'd been pretending not to watch returned to their meals, the brief spike of tension dissipating like smoke. But Tina was still looking at him, and in her eyes he saw something he recognized because he'd spent years perfecting it himself, the ability to see through people, to strip away the performance and witness the truth underneath. You've built quite the empire, she said softly. Armed guards. Fear wherever you walk. Everyone knowing your name. Everyone getting out of your way. She tilted her head. Is it everything you thought it would be? Ben felt the question land like a punch to the ribs. He wanted to deflect, to redirect, to regain control of this conversation that had spiraled so far beyond his grasp, he wasn't sure he'd ever held it to begin with. But something about sitting across from Tina Morales, the woman who'd saved him, who'd sacrificed everything, who was now dying because of a choice she'd made in the space between one heartbeat and the next, made all his usual defenses feel obscene. No, he said, and the admission cost him something he didn't know he had left to give. It's not. The words hung between them, true and terrible. Ben Wade, who'd spent 8 years building a reputation that made grown men nervous and politicians compliant, who'd turned the South Side from Marcus's territory into his own empire, who'd convinced himself that power was its own reward. He sat in this expensive restaurant and confessed what he'd never admitted to anyone, including himself. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. Your father used to tell me, Ben said, his voice rough, that respect and fear weren't the same thing. That you could rule through fear, but you'd always be looking over your shoulder. Always waiting for someone younger, hungrier, more ruthless to come along and do to you what you did to everyone else. He looked down at his hands, clean, manicured, unmarked by the violence they'd orchestrated. I told him I understood. But I didn't. Not really. He believed in you, Tina said, and there was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made it worse. He told me once that you reminded him of himself at your age. Smart. Ambitious. But also principled. He thought you'd be different. That you'd change things. Ben felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built so carefully over the years splintering under the weight of what he'd become versus what Marcus had hoped he'd be. Why didn't you tell me it was you? The question escaped before he could stop it, raw and desperate and stripped of all pretense. 10 years, Tina. You knew where I was. You could have found me, could have told me what happened, could have what? Tina's voice sharpened. Shown up at your door and said, remember me, I'm the girl who saved your life and lost the ability to walk? Expected gratitude? Expected you to what? Take care of me out of obligation. She shook her head. I didn't want to be your charity case, Ben. I didn't want to be another problem you solved with money or guilt or whatever currency men like you trade in. Then what did you want? Ben heard the desperation in his own voice and didn't care anymore. What do you want now? Tina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth, navigating around the scattered pieces of his torn check like they were wreckage from a shipwreck. I wanted you to be better, she finally said. I wanted to believe that saving you meant something. That my father's death, my legs, all of it, that it had purchased something worthwhile. Some kind of change. Some kind of redemption. She looked up, and the grief in her eyes was bottomless. But you became exactly what my father feared. You took his territory, his reputation, his legacy, and you turned it into something he would have been ashamed of. The words should have made him angry. Should have triggered the defensive rage that had protected him for years. Instead, Ben felt only the crushing weight of truth. I know, he whispered. And for the first time in a decade, Ben Wade, the feared Mafia boss, the man who never apologized, who never showed weakness, felt genuine guilt crack him open like an egg. Ben's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table, trying to still the tremor, but it spread up his arms, into his chest, until he felt like his entire body was coming apart at the seams. He'd been shot twice in his life, stabbed once, beaten more times than he could count in the early days when he was still proving himself. None of it compared to sitting across from Tina Morales and watching her dissect him with nothing but the truth. "Say something," Tina said quietly. "Defend yourself. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you built something my father would be proud of." But Ben couldn't. The words wouldn't come because they'd be lies, and somehow, sitting here with this woman who'd given up everything to save him, lying felt like the one sin he couldn't commit. Not now. Not to her. When Marcus died, Ben started, then stopped, his voice catching. He cleared his throat, tried again. "When your father died, there was a vacuum. You have to understand, in this business, power doesn't wait. It doesn't pause for grief or questions or doing the right thing. Someone was going to take the south side. It was going to be me or it was going to be the Volkov brothers, and if it was them, don't," Tina interrupted, her voice sharp. "Don't justify it to me. Don't make this about necessity or survival or protecting the neighborhood from something worse. I've heard those excuses before. My father used them too, when my mother would ask him why he couldn't just walk away, why he couldn't choose us over the life." She leaned forward, and the candlelight caught the anger in her eyes. "But you know what the difference was? My father had limits. He had lines he wouldn't cross. He had principles that actually meant something." "I have principles," Ben said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Do you?" Tina's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Tell me, Ben, how many people have died because of orders you gave? How many families have been destroyed because you decided their father, their brother, their son was a problem that needed eliminating?" Ben felt each question like a blade between his ribs. He wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that the people he'd killed were killers themselves, that in this world it was kill or be killed, that he'd only done what was necessary to survive. But Marcus had survived for 20 years without becoming a monster. Marcus had built an empire on respect instead of terror, on strategy instead of bodies. And Ben had thrown it all away in 8 years. "The restaurant owner on 5th Street, Tina said, her voice steady but relentless. "Mr. Chin. He refused to pay protection money last year because his daughter needed surgery and he couldn't afford both. Do you remember what happened to him?" Ben remembered. He delegated it to Victor, hadn't wanted to deal with the details, but he knew how these things went. A message needed to be sent. Examples needed to be made. The restaurant had burned to the ground 3 days after Chen's refusal. Insurance had covered the building, but not the equipment, not the inventory, not the decade of reputation Chen had built. "He lost everything," Tina continued. "And his daughter? She never got the surgery. She's in a wheelchair now too. Degenerative condition that could have been stopped if her father had been able to afford the treatment." She paused, let that sink in. "Tell me, Ben, was that necessary? Was destroying a good man and crippling his child necessary to maintain your empire?" "I didn't know about the daughter," Ben said, and hated how weak it sounded. "You didn't ask," Tina shot back. "That's the point. You don't ask because knowing would make it harder, and you've built your entire life around making hard things easy. Kill the conscience, kill the questions, kill anything that might make you feel like the villain you've become." Ben felt something inside him starting to crack, the foundations of the person he'd built himself into beginning to crumble. "What do you want me to say?" His voice was raw. "That I'm sorry? That I regret it? That if I could go back, and I don't want your apologies," Tina said, and there were tears on her cheeks now, though her voice remained steady. "I don't want your regrets. I don't want anything from you, Ben, because there's nothing you can give me that would make any of this okay." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, an angry, frustrated gesture. "Do you know what the worst part is? Do you want to know what really breaks my heart?" Ben couldn't speak. He could only nod. "I didn't want you to owe me, Ben," Tina said, and her voice finally broke. "I didn't save you so you'd feel guilty. I didn't pull you from that wreckage so you'd spend the rest of your life trying to pay me back. I saved you because in that moment, you were a human being who was going to die, and I had the power to stop it. It was that simple. That pure." She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. "And I told myself, God, I told myself for years that it meant something. That saving you was saving the good man my father believed in. That you'd take what he taught you and build something better. Something that mattered." She looked up, and the devastation in her eyes was complete. "But you didn't. You became the worst of them all. You took my father's legacy and turned it into a nightmare. You became exactly the kind of man he spent his life fighting against. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't want you to owe me, Ben. I wanted you to be better than them. And you failed. You failed him. You failed me. You failed yourself. The words landed like a final blow, and Ben Wade, the man who never broke, who never showed weakness, who'd built an empire on being harder and colder than everyone else, felt himself shatter completely. Ben didn't see them enter. He was too focused on Tina's face, on the tears tracking down her cheeks, on the weight of her words crushing whatever was left of the man he'd pretended to be. But some instinct, the same animal awareness that had kept him alive in this business for 15 years, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He caught the reflection first, in the polished silver of the water pitcher. 3 men, moving through the restaurant with a kind of casual confidence that wasn't casual at all. They were dressed well enough to blend in, expensive suits that almost looked legitimate, but Ben knew the signs. The way they scanned the room. The bulges under their jackets. The coordinated movement of predators who'd worked together before. And they were looking directly at his table. Ben's mind shifted gears instantly, survival instinct overriding everything else. Volkov's men. Had to be. The Russians had been pushing into South Side territory for months, testing his boundaries, waiting for a moment of weakness. And here he was, guards dismissed, emotional defenses shattered, sitting in a public restaurant with a woman in a wheelchair who couldn't run if things went bad. He'd given them exactly what they needed. Tina, Ben said quietly, his voice shifting into the cold, controlled register of a man assessing threats. I need you to stay very calm and listen to me carefully. She must have heard something in his tone because her tears stopped immediately, her expression shifting from grief to alertness. What's wrong? 3 men, approaching from the bar, Ben said, his hand moving slowly under the table to the holster at his ankle. Don't look at them. Keep your eyes on me. When I move, you get under this table and you stay there. Understand? Ben, what do you understand? His voice cracked like a whip and she nodded, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. The lead man reached their table, a broad-shouldered Russian with a scar running from his temple to his jaw and eyes like chips of ice. Ben recognized him, Alexei Volkov's lieutenant, a man named Konstantin who had a reputation for making people disappear slowly. Ben Wade, Konstantin said, his accent thick, his smile showing too many teeth. Is rude to dismiss your security, no? Makes a man wonder if you are losing your edge. Ben stood slowly, deliberately, putting himself between Konstantin and Tina. The movement was fluid, controlled, but his hand had already found the compact Glock at his ankle. This is a private conversation, Konstantin. Walk away. Private? Konstantin's eyes slid past Ben to Tina, and his smile widened. Is this the woman who makes the great Ben Wade send away his guard dogs? She must be very special. He took a step closer. Alexei sends his regards. He says to tell you that weakness is very dangerous in our business. The other 2 men had fanned out, blocking the nearest exits. The restaurant's other patrons were starting to notice, conversations dying, silverware going still. Ben could see the hostess reaching for the phone, but that wouldn't help. Whatever was going to happen would be over before the police arrived. Last chance, Ben said softly. Walk away, and we pretend this never happened. Stay, and I put you down right here in front of everyone. Konstantin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You are alone, Wade. You are, how do you say, compromised. You think you can Ben moved. 15 years of violence, of survival, of becoming exactly the monster Tina had accused him of being, all of it condensed into 3 seconds of controlled brutality. He stepped inside Konstantin's guard, drove his elbow into the Russian's throat, and had the Glock out and pressed under his chin before the other man could finish his sentence. Get down. Ben shouted at Tina, and to her credit, she didn't hesitate. She dropped from her wheelchair to the floor with practiced efficiency, using her arms to pull herself under the table. The second man was already reaching for his weapon, but Ben was faster. He pivoted, using Konstantin's body as a shield, and fired twice. The suppressor he always kept on the ankle gun turned the shots into muffled coughs. Both rounds hit center mass, and the man went down hard, his own weapon clattering across the marble floor. The third man got his gun out, panic making him sloppy. He fired wild, and Ben felt the bullet pass close enough to his ear that he heard it whisper. The shot shattered a wine glass 3 tables away, and suddenly the restaurant erupted into chaos, screaming, people diving under tables, the crash of chairs hitting the floor. Ben didn't hesitate. He shoved Constantine away, dropped into a crouch, and put 2 rounds into the third man's leg. Not a kill shot. Not yet. The man screamed and went down, his gun skittering away. Constantine was on his knees, gasping, his hands at his throat. Ben stood over him, the Glock steady, aimed at the center of his forehead. "Tell Alexei," Ben said, his voice devoid of emotion, "that if he ever comes near her again, I will burn his entire organization to the ground. Every lieutenant, every soldier, every person who's ever said his name with respect. Tell him I'll salt the earth where his empire stood." He pressed the barrel of the gun against Constantine's forehead. "And tell him Ben Wade is done playing nice." He pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. Ben had counted his shots, knew exactly how many rounds he had left, but Constantine didn't know that. The Russian's bladder let go, the stains spreading across his expensive suit, and he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Ben dropped the empty gun, turned, and knelt beside the table where Tina was still pressed against the floor, her eyes wide. "Are you hurt?" His hands were already moving over her, checking for blood, for wounds, for any sign that a stray bullet had found her. "No," she whispered. "Ben, we need to leave. Now." He reached for her, ready to lift her into her arms, to get her out of this restaurant and somewhere safe, to use every resource of his empire to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Because in those 3 seconds of violence, something had crystallized in Ben Wade's mind with perfect, terrible clarity. He was a monster. Tina was right about that. But he could be her monster. He could take everything he'd become, all the darkness, all the violence, all the ruthless efficiency, and point it at one single purpose: keeping her alive. Can a monster find redemption by protecting the person he hurt most? Drop your thoughts below. Does Ben deserve a second chance? The safe house was in Brooklyn, a brownstone that looked like every other building on the tree-lined street, but had reinforced doors, bulletproof windows, and enough security equipment to protect a head of state. Ben had carried Tina from the restaurant to the waiting SUV. Victor and Dmitri had arrived 30 seconds after the shooting, weapons drawn, faces white with the kind of fear that came from failing to protect their boss, and he hadn't let go of her since. She sat now in the living room, back in her wheelchair that Victor had retrieved from Il Posto along with her purse and coat. The place was decorated like a hotel, functional, anonymous, designed for temporary occupation by people who needed to disappear. Ben stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, issuing orders in the clipped, efficient tone of a general mobilizing for war. "Every asset we have. I want Alexei Volkov's location within the hour. I want to know where he sleeps, where he eats, where he pisses. And I want a message sent to every family in the city. Anyone who touches this woman answers to me personally." He paused, listening. "I don't care what it costs. Liquidate whatever you need to. This is priority 1. He ended the call and immediately made another. Tina watched him work, this strange choreography of violence and logistics, seeing the machine of his empire spin up in real time. He was calling doctors now, specialists, his voice never wavering as he demanded appointments, consultations, access to the neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins that Tina had mentioned. "Money is not an issue," Ben said into the phone. "I don't care if you have to charter a plane to bring him here. I don't care if you have to buy the entire hospital. I want the best, and I want them now." When he finally set the phone down, the silence in the room was deafening. "You can't do this," Tina said quietly. Ben turned to face her, and in the soft lamplight, she could see how the violence at the restaurant had changed him. Or maybe it hadn't changed him at all. Maybe it had just revealed what was always there, the capacity for ruthless efficiency, the willingness to burn the world down to protect what he'd claimed as his. "I can," he said simply. "And I will. I don't want to be your project, Ben." She kept her voice steady, though exhaustion was creeping in around the edges. "I didn't tell you about the surgery so you'd fix it. I told you because I needed you to understand what your life cost. I understand. He crossed the room, pulled a chair over, and sat so they were eye level. Believe me, Tina, I understand exactly what my life cost. And I can't change that. I can't give you back the last 10 years. I can't undo the accident or bring your father back or make any of this okay. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. But I can make sure you don't die. I can make sure you get the surgery. I can make sure you never have to worry about money or housing or being safe ever again. That's not redemption, Tina said. That's just guilt with a checkbook. I know. Ben's voice cracked, and she saw him struggling with something, saw the careful control he wore like armor starting to fracture. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't make me better or undo what I've become. But it's all I have, Tina. It's the only thing I can give you that matters. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd been broken and rebuilt into something terrible, who'd taken her father's legacy and twisted it into something Marcus would have hated. She should send him away. Should refuse his help and his money and his protection. Should maintain the moral high ground she'd held onto for 10 years while she watched him become a monster from a distance. But she was also dying. And pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Why? She asked. Why do you care? You didn't even remember me 6 hours ago. You were ready to write me a check and walk away. What changed? Ben was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're the only person who's ever really seen me, he said. Not the reputation. Not the power. Not the monster everyone else sees. You saw who I was supposed to be. Who Marcus thought I could be. He looked up, and his eyes were raw. And you're the only person who's ever been brave enough to tell me I failed. Tina felt something shift in her chest, some locked door she'd kept sealed for a decade starting to crack open. Everyone else either fears me or wants something from me, Ben continued. They see Ben Wade, the boss, the weapon, the problem solver. But you? You looked at me tonight and saw a man who made the wrong choices. A man who could have been better and chose not to be. A man who's been lying to himself for so long he almost believed it. He reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. I can't fix what I broke, Tina. But maybe if I can save you, if I can use everything I've built to give you back your future, maybe that's a start. A start toward what? She asked. I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him everything. Being someone you wouldn't be ashamed to have saved. Being someone Marcus wouldn't regret believing in. Being, he stopped, swallowed hard. Being worth the sacrifice you made. Tina looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, hers small and marked with the calluses that came from years of pushing a wheelchair. She thought about her father, about the night it all ended, about the choice she'd made to pull Ben Wade from the wreckage instead of running to Marcus. She thought about 10 years of pain and adaptation and rebuilding a life from ruins. And she thought about the fact that in 8 weeks, without the surgery, she would lose everything she'd fought to maintain. I have conditions, she said finally. Ben's head snapped up, hope flickering across his face like a match strike in darkness. Anything. You don't just pay for my surgery. You pay for the Chin Girl's surgery too. And anyone else who's been hurt by your empire, you find them, and you make it right. Done. You stop the protection rackets. The violence. All of it. You don't get to save me and keep destroying other people. Ben hesitated, and she saw him calculating, saw the businessman in him trying to figure out if he could maintain power without those tools. It's complicated. I didn't say it would be easy, Tina said. I said it's a condition. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, I'll find another way. And one more thing. She squeezed his hand, held his gaze. You don't leave my side. Not because you're guarding me or protecting me or keeping me like some kind of penance project. You stay because you want to be better and you need someone who will tell you the truth when you start sliding back. Ben Wade, the man who never made promises he couldn't keep, who'd learned that commitments were liabilities and emotional attachments were weaknesses, felt something fundamental shift inside him. I can do that, he said. And for the first time in 10 years, Tina Morales allowed herself to believe that maybe saving Ben Wade hadn't been a mistake. Maybe it had been the beginning of something neither of them expected. Redemption. Thank you for listening until the very end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story. There's another story like the one you just enjoyed on your left screen.